So welcome everybody to the session titled Taking History Out of the Textbooks. And we were discussing earlier amongst ourselves that there's actually two ways one can interpret the title. The first is how do you make history more engaging? So all of us, when we were in school, we at least me personally, I don't know about you, I remember having to literally memorize my entire history textbook for my 10th boards. I could recite it from cover to cover, verbatim, and in fact, there was an expectation that if you did not exactly regurgitate that language, your marks would be cut. And of course, that's a very boring, dry, unengaging way to learn history. And it's all about dates and what happened in this year and what happened in that, and you have to just so now there's been a lot of effort in recent years to say, how do we make history more engaging? And so that's really the first interpretation of the topic, and we're going to discuss that in the first half of the session. And I'll come to the second interpretation later on if we have time. So as was mentioned in my introduction, I have set up a museum in Amritsar on the partition. And so that's a bias I have coming into this session, that we've set it up as a people's museum. So we try and tell the history of partition through people's perspectives, what happened to the ordinary person. It's not about Mountbatten and Jinnah and Gandhi as much as it is about your grandfather and my parents, etc. So my first question is very much along those lines. I have with me this very eminent panel, and they've all very interestingly written books that look at history from that perspective by using individuals and exploring their humanness, in a sense, to tell history. So my first question is to you, Manu. You've written the two books, The Ivory Throne and Rebel Sultans, and both of them have all this intrigue and scandal, and you look at history in a very interesting way by focusing on some of the elements that normally get left out. So it's not about the battlefield as much as it is about the lives. Can you talk a bit about that?
You mentioned partition to begin with. The fact is that when you start looking at partition beyond the dates, beyond the violence, and beyond the general material that you have, and start looking at objects, what did the people say? To begin with, that's where a lot of female voices come in to begin with, because their memories, etc., get covered. We'll come to that eventually. But one of the attractions of looking at history through the perspective of the people who made history, the people who were there, is that while their contexts are often different from ours, while their times are often different from ours, a lot of core impulses of human beings don't necessarily change over time, which means that it's easier to relate to the past through the eyes of historical figures if you understand them first, and then try to make sense of the time in which they existed and the time in which they accomplished what they did. So in looking at history through people, you're already breaking down a lot of binaries that exist. You're already trying to understand, human beings are complex beings. So when you're trying to understand history through human beings, you start realizing that history is also therefore very complex. So it challenges these shortcuts we take often in trying to understand the past. In my first book, for me, it was a big eye-opening experience to realize that power between these two women, it was my protagonist and the antagonist, they were both very powerful, interesting women. The way they negotiated power, how much of it was personal vendetta, how much of it was driven by personal ideology, how both of them were products of the matrilineal system, which technically empowered women far better than it did in other parts, the patriarchal system did elsewhere. And yet, one of them had bought into the Victorian notion of what a woman should be, resulting in a somewhat formal marriage, but also resulting in a certain fashion in the way she negotiated power and held power and expected women to behave. Her sister, on the other hand, held on to the old matrilineal system where the men really didn't meet very much in her life. And the result was that she got branded a certain way, she wasn't welcome, etc. And this affected their politics, this affected the way decisions were taken in the corridors of power and so on. And very quickly you realize that, these people who are there in history, they're the ones who finally sit there. It is their core prejudices, weaknesses, concerns, these are what reflect in their actions in the end. Yesterday in another panel, I was saying that, when people in the past woke up in the morning, they didn't think we're living in a golden age. They didn't think that we are creating history. They were going about their lives. They were fighting their inner demons, their battles of the time. And it's only now in retrospect that we try to assign certain values to them. But in trying, therefore, to penetrate history by penetrating their minds first, their characters, their motivations, we are, therefore, better equipped to deal with understanding the past ourselves.
That's a very interesting point you're making in that I think now when we look back on people, we tend to ascribe to them, that people in the past must have somehow been different from who we are. They were great in some way. Sunil, in your book, 50 Lives, what's very interesting is that you actually take these people who we do think of as great in some way and you humanize them. You look at them in all of their grittiness. Can you talk a little bit about why you felt it was important to write the history of India through looking at these 50 people and this idea of exploring them in this very non-black and white way?
Absolutely. I'll just step back for a second and just explain why I wanted to write this kind of a history in the first place. And in an earlier book that I'd written called The Idea of India, it was really about the foundations of the modern Indian Republic, looking at this moment in the 20th century when basically our nation was founded. And in doing that, I realized that actually our republic, our nation, is based and built on a particular conception of the past and of the relationship of that past to our present and future. And I felt that in recent years, we had been consciously and intentionally misunderstanding our past in a way that I think politically was quite dangerous for our republic today. So I wanted to try and provide an account of Indian history, which I think was in a sense true to the political project of what modern India is. And I decided to try and produce a kind of long span of Indian history, which is academically very unfashionable. Today in the profession of history, you focus on, sort of water irrigation, 1874 to 1879 in a particular district, which is great. I mean, we need that kind of work. I'm not knocking it at all. We need that kind of very detailed research. But I didn't want to do that. I wanted to kind of see, can we write a long history of India, which was what used to be done in earlier decades. And so I then began to think, well, how do you tell that history? And as you said in your introduction, those kind of histories generally are completely unreadable. They're full of dynasties, dates, defeats, victories. You can't make any sense of it. I couldn't make any sense of it. So I thought, can one take 50 figures, 50 individuals across the span of Indian history, 50 individuals whose lives themselves are intrinsically interesting and fascinating, who in a sense were acting against the grain of their social and historical moments, and whose lives in a sense also embodied conflicts that run through Indian history, tensions, whether they were tensions about caste or religion or gender or region or whatever it might be, about individuality, and which captured particular moments in the span of 2,500 years of Indian history. And so that was the decision to focus on individuals. The book was always conceived in parallel with a podcast and radio series. And then what I also wanted to do, as you pointed out, was when I began to look at these individuals, I saw that actually we didn't really see them as individuals. We saw them as icons or myths. They had become these kind of mythic or iconic figures. So my interest was to, in a sense, chisel away at the varnish and paint and ornament that we'd placed upon them and to recover the anatomy of their lives as individuals. What did they look like? And in a sense, it was precisely to say that it was their humanity, their flaws, their weaknesses, which actually make them even greater because, they still did what they did despite having these flaws and weaknesses. So it was to kind of get away both from the nationalist myth-making that has surrounded many of these lives, but also the cultural and religious and other kinds of myth-making that has kind of covered them over.
Thanks, Sunil. I'm going to ask both of you after this to maybe give an example of some of that flavor and coloring that you gave some of the individuals in your book, just a juicy anecdote to give the audience a sense of how exploring history through a people's perspective does make it more engaging. David, in your work, also in your most recent book, what I found fascinating is, again, you focused on what one can call the forgotten people of the Raj. Your book is on, again, not on the the Raj as we normally think about it, but it's around like the people working in the railways, for example, or in the police. So can you talk a little bit about why you decided to write a book looking at those forgotten people and kind of the social history of the Raj?
Yes, of course. By the way, I have problems with microphones as well. Will you tell me if you can't hear? Is it all right so far? I mean, they're enemies of mine. Okay. Yes, well, I've always found it more interesting to write about people as individuals and human beings rather than as classes or categories or groups. It's more fun to write and it's more fun to read. And I'd written biographies of two quite controversial Raj figures, Lord Curzon and Rudyard Kipling, and then I wanted to write about other people. I did a study of the ICS, but no, I wanted to go wider and deeper, and as you say, some of the forgotten people, or some of the people in backwaters, the people who are digging the canals or working up in the forests. And I also wanted to write about the people who came here by accident, and many of them didn't plan to spend Indian careers. But I wanted to write about slightly marginal people. I once had a wonderful tutor at Oxford called Richard Cobb. He also wrote about marginal people. And at a conference once, a French historian lost his temper and said, "But prostitutes don't make history." Well, they don't. But they are part of history. And to me, they are as interesting, they belong to history as the railwaymen and as viceroys, perhaps more interesting. And though I haven't, in this particular book, I was very interested in some of the characters we used to call loafers, people who, they were sort of tramps, they're usually drunk, they traveled at night, they found sort of places to sleep in the bazaars, they drank a lot. And they were, Rudyard Kipling once heard a story from, in Peshawar, Lahore, of a couple of loafers who'd come through the Khyber Pass from Afghanistan, and he turned them into those wonderful characters, slightly glamorized in the film The Man Who Would Be King with Sean Connery and Michael Caine. So these are people I wanted to capture in my book.
Great, thank you. So Manu, can you, as I said, give us an example of some juicy anecdote in your book that demonstrates kind of how the point that we were making?
I think my protagonist was already a very entertaining, interesting figure. Her career itself, she's a long-lost, footnoted character, because the larger trend in India is that, everything became about national history, about national struggle. And she was on the wrong side of that equation because she was the queen of a princely state, so ended up being footnoted anyway. But it was a fascinating story because she was installed as queen at the age of 5. By the time she was in her teens, she was fighting these great battles at court against various factions that were there. In her late 20s, she was ruling over 5 million people, and she ruled very well, dealing with Gandhi and Tagore and people like that. By the 30s, her own family sidelined her, and she became a non-entity. In her 40s, India became independent. In her 50s and 60s, communism came to power in what used to be a Hindu princely state in Kerala, Travancore. And this lady in her 60s gives up her palace, gives up her 300 servants, moves to Bangalore and becomes a complete non-entity, where she dies at the age of nearly 90 and is cremated in a public crematorium like anybody else. So at one time, her birthdays were state ceremonies with 21 gun salutes, and by the time she died, she was essentially a nobody who had, spent the last 25 years in oblivion. But it was also that trying to figure out her career, which had these ups and downs, but also the ecosystem in which she existed, the world in which she occupied this position as queen. She was the product of a matrilineal system that was already under assault because of the colonial influences, but also because of Victorian morality. So as part of the matrilineal system, for example, her husband was not her husband. He was called the consort. He was not allowed to sit in her presence. He had to remain standing. He could not call his wife by name. He had to call her Your Highness. At feasts in the palace, she was served 4 desserts or payasams, he was served 2. Where she had a 21-gun salute, he had a rifle salute. And perhaps, the negative side is also that when he died, before he breathed his last or whatever, he'd be lifted with a Scot, the husbands, and taken away to die in a faraway building because only members of the royal family could die in the palace, whereas the husband was not a member of the royal family. The queen and her kids couldn't even go for the funeral, even though she would have been married to him for very many years. Before the Victorians came, she could have had more than one husband. So the world that she occupied was fascinating, and yet Victorian influences were so strong that she felt that she had to exalt her husband to a great degree of importance. So the height of scandal in the 1910s was when her uncle, the then Maharaja, realized that she was driving with her husband together. The rule was very simple. You never drive with your husband because your husband is not meant to be seen with you in public. If by some chance he's in the same car, he has to sit opposite her, never next to her, because that signifies equality, and he's never an equal. So this world that she occupied was so riveting. I grew up in Pune, where my textbooks talked about widow remarriage being a great reform. And I would go back to Kerala, where my grandmother told me that my great-great-grandmother was a divorcee in the 1880s, and it was perfectly normal then. And her second husband, my great-great-grandfather, himself had an earlier marriage. Their son ended up marrying 4 women in a line and divorcing 3 of them before he settled for the last one. There's the sister, my great-grandmother's older daughter, had one husband first, then she gave him up and took another husband. So when we talk about, and these are orthodox upper caste people, they used to talk to each other in Sanskrit just for fun. But all the same, they existed in a universe which most Malayalis now don't know about. Women in Kerala didn't wear blouses. To cover yourself above the waist was considered indecent. If the first Brahmin woman to do it in the 1920s was excommunicated. So trying to go through the story of this queen also opened up massive social changes, these currents that came in and completely in a matter of a few generations transformed this space. And the queen herself, the result of a matrilineal order, was a lady who in 1925 abolished the matrilineal system because the pressure on her off changing times was so strong. And I found that this was just absolutely gripping. And she'd been footnoted, the whole story had been footnoted, and the fact that we didn't end up studying these things in school or even later, and most Malayalis didn't know, I thought convinced me that, these stories needed a resurrection. And of course it helped that they were entertaining.
Sunil, can you talk about anybody in your book who, what we were discussing earlier was this idea that when we look at some of the figures in your book, we tend to think of them in a very singular way as in their greatness, but can you give an example of somebody when as you kind of dived into it, you really found the many facets of their character and something that you've written about?
Yeah, one of the things, just as I was trying to sort of tell a story over a long span of history and, avoiding some of the usual periodizations that the academic disciplines or popular categorizations used, I was also ranging across a whole series of different fields. So I talk about mathematicians, about philosophers, about religious figures, about poets, about photographers, about artists, including politicians as well. And I guess, for me, one of the pleasures of the book was having to learn about different fields, about art history, about the history of science and mathematics. And so some of the surprises that struck me were centered on some of those lives. So just to give you an example, I have an essay in the book about the great early 18th century painter, Pahari painter Nansuk, about whom we've learned, he's one of the few individual painters about whom we know a bit through the wonderful scholarship of B.N. Goswami, who studied him. And I went and I looked really quite closely at Nansuk's miniatures, several of which are in the V&A, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And he was a court painter. He worked for a minor patron in the hills. And he was a very unusual and eccentric painter in the sense that his patron also allowed him, the Nansuk, to paint him, the prince, in a whole variety of non-grand poses. So he paints his patron when he's got a fever, huddled under a blanket, drinking a kind of hot drink and so on. But one of the paintings, a moment that really struck me about Nansuk's humanity and his eye was this, that he paints a typical court musical scene. There's an evening concert and musicians are performing for the prince. And it's all fairly formulaic and standardized. And then you start to look closely at the faces. And on one face, you see pockmarks. And you realize that this is smallpox that this painter has got. And suddenly you see the life of an ordinary musician what it must have been like. And you see sort of somehow the street, the non-princely side of life there in the court. And you realize that this is probably a musician that Nansuk must have known. And it brings alive with a kind of intimacy this art which we think is so formulaic and dead and you know, just almost kind of decorative. And that kind of attention to lives in their eyes, I think, for me, was a way of discovering how these individuals saw the world and how they related to the world. And so it was moments like that which brought the humanity of the life and the moment back to me.
One thing that I think, Manu, you spoke about is the women of that time. And as a woman, I'm always particularly interested in the fact that women are often the forgotten people in history. That's often because there aren't a lot of sources that allow us to really explore what was happening with women in history. So David, in your book, what I found particularly interesting is that you look at the lives of the Mem Sahibs. And now when most of us think of the Mem Sahibs, we have this very stereotypical image in our mind that they're all just going to masquerade balls and socializing and having a grand old time. But in the course of your research, you found that the lived experience of the women in the Raj was often quite different from our common image of them. Can you talk a little bit about, give some examples from your book about the lives of the Mem Sahibs? And you know, when we were speaking earlier, you said how many of them didn't intend to come here. They just married their sweetheart, and next thing they know, they're kind of in the middle of tropical country.
Yes, well, many of them were here without intending to be here, and for many years they had no role, except they came as wives, sisters, daughters, brides-to-be. And that was very difficult until late in the 19th century. Of course, the Mem Sahib is the biggest stereotype of British India. We've all seen her. And E.M. Forster immortalized her very, very cruelly. He didn't know them well, as Mrs. Turton and Mrs. Callender in a passage to India. And undoubtedly there were women like that, snobbish, racist, standoffish. But they were not all right. I mean, a lot of women hated going to the club and playing bridge and eating and drinking, you know, gin and lime juice. They were longing to get out and explore India and learn Indian languages. And one of the women I'm thinking of, I'm sure many people know about, the scientist and biologist Richard Dawkins, very famous in Britain at the moment. His grandmother was a Mem Sahib in Burma. She never went to the club, she never played bridge. All she wanted to be was to be trekking around the forests of Burma. And her one regret was that the Purdah system made it practically impossible for her to make friends with Indian women. But a lot of other British women came out around about 1900, a bit before, later, to work here as nurses, as medical missionaries, as teachers. And they also took part in Indian life, but you don't see them in glossy films about the Raj.
Sunil, in your book, there are women profiled, but I would say, and I think you agree, you mentioned it in the book, that perhaps not enough. Can you say a little bit about why?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, that is one of my great regrets about the book, that they're not in the overall number. They're about, of the 50, there's 6 women, and I desperately wanted there to be more. And, you know, one of the problems, I think you just alluded to it, one of the great problems is the lack of documentary sources. That because the history was generally written by men, for men, about men, it's actually very, very hard to find substantial documentary sources which can really give you a picture of the lives of women. If you go back and look, for example, at some of the Chola temples, you'll be able to find inscriptions that will show women as donors and people who've endowed temples. And so you get fragments here and there, but very little substantial material. So the women who I write about, I write about Mirabai, I write about the Rani of Jhansi, I write about Annie Besant, Amrita Shergill, Indira Gandhi. But but one of the, there were two strategies really. I mean, one was to say, I'm not just going to write about the things that matter for women only in the essays about women. So actually, I deal with questions of gender and questions about women's position and status in essays throughout the book. So whether it's the Buddha or the Mahavir Jain or Phule or Ram Mohan Roy or Periyar, I mean, the question of women is running through the book. So it's not just confined to, here are the essays on women, and I'm only going to talk about women in these essays, which just seems to be a completely ridiculous way of thinking about it anyway. So that was a very conscious way of addressing that issue. As I say, it runs through the whole book. And the other thing that I also, was very clear in the book was that this tendency to, I mean, women in Indian history, above all, are mythified and deified. Their humanity is almost doubly denied. One, because you don't have any documentary evidence, and so you can really, even more kind of turn them into these mythic figures. The Rani of Jhansi would be a clear such case, but this is true of Mirabai too. So what I wanted to capture was the way in which these were very fierce, critical individuals who independent-minded, who took hard choices. In the case of Mirabai, giving up a particular kind of comfortable Rajput princely life. In the case of the Rani of Jhansi, really trying to diplomatically maneuver between the British and others. So it was an attempt to kind of de-deify and demythify them. And the case of Amrita Shergill as well, the painter, to bring back her complicated human character. So that was a way, but I do think that there's a moment in the Rani of Jhansi, there's this apocryphal story that she had a trunk full of letters and documents which disappeared, and for me that's a kind of an image of this lost treasure of the history of women in India, and we do have to work harder. There's some Mughal sources, but it really requires a lot more work and a lot more imagination in how we address that absence of sources.
And I think one of the things that helps us in kind of doing this is, as Manu, you said earlier, is if we go beyond traditional sources, right? If we start to think more broadly about what exists, so objects you had mentioned earlier. Certainly in the museum, that's one thing we do. So as I mentioned earlier, I run the Partition Museum, and it's very much based on oral history. It's very much based on people's objects, so things that they carried with them when they came as refugees, and telling history through that. And doing that has allowed us, for example, in the museum to create a whole section on the women's experiences of partition. And I think when I think of the museum, I think one of the powerful things we do is we are bringing history alive for people by making it into a very physical space, a very audio-visual space. And so I guess a question I would have for all of you is, we've talked about your books as kind of an engaging way of looking at people's lives as one way to make history engaging. What are the other exciting things that you see out there in terms of bringing history alive, and particularly as audiences get younger? I mean, India's becoming a younger and younger country. What can we do particularly to make history engaging for young people? David,
on the question of women, what is interesting is that once you're aware that there is a problem in the fact that women are not only absent, but they're often written out or deliberately expunged from history, then you can also approach the same material, as Sunil was saying, with your eyes open. That helps. So recently, I read Ira Mukoti's book on Mughal women, and we like to think they were just sequestered and put away in the harem, whereas they were political actors. Mariam Zamani, Jahangir's mother, the Rajput lady, was a shipping magnate. Mughal-Portuguese relations depended a great deal. In fact, they folded to a close quite disastrously when they decided to burn her ship. Babur's daughter, Emperor Humayun's sister, Gulbadan Begum, wanted to go on the Hajj to Mecca, and the Portuguese detained her for an entire year. They wouldn't give her leave to take off. And although Akbar was in power at the time, he He had no way to control the seas. In the end, she had to give the Portuguese an entire city in order to be able to go to Mecca, come back a few years later, and then go to war against the Portuguese. So again, she was present. Ida talks wonderfully about how Mughal women went out to negotiate treaties. When Jahangir rises up in rebellion against his father, it's one of his aunts who goes out to try and sort that out. Elsewhere, Jahangir's son then tries to rebel against him. The mother ends up committing suicide. The women were there. Their stories are there. It's just that we haven't made an effort to go out and find them and tell them the right way. The other thing is also that these stories, especially with women, because as Sunil was saying, we tend to deify them. We want them either as goddesses or as sluts. There's nothing in the middle. No woman of flesh and blood and actual personality. Everyday personality. What happens is that even strong existing women are rewritten in ways that sort of paint them in a certain fashion. So in the 17th century, when the English came to the court of the Maharaja of Travancore, they wanted a settlement by the beach. And it turned out that all of that property belonged to the king's sister, who ruled half the kingdom, and she was called the Rani of Attingal. So they go there and they obtain a trade treaty from her. And this is a woman who led armies. She had 15,000 men under her. She used to ride horses, go into battle. Her brother was so scared of her that every time she went into his capital, he would flee and go off and park himself somewhere else. When ships were shipwrecked, before the king's men reached there, the queen's men got there and took all the booty from underwater. So she was a woman of power and personality. And yet by the 20th century, she was turned into this damsel in distress, a motherless woman, as though she was some sort of sentimental creature that 20th century men wanted women to be. She became an ideal of piety and greatness in that mold, as opposed to the warrior queen she was. So that, is a problem with women in Indian history. In terms of how to make Indian history interesting, so long as your research is solid, so long as you bring academic rigor in the way you approach your material and the way you deal with the archives, but then you try and bridge that with an accessible, engaging, appealing style of writing, then you can easily reach out to a large audience. We live in the age of WhatsApp history and Twitter history, which a lot of rubbish is peddled simply by taking screenshots of Google Books, which is not what I mean by popularizing history. Popularizing history is to simply tell the stories better, to make an effort not only in terms of researching and unearthing good stories, but also in telling those stories in an interesting way, in trying to get the reader to get involved in the story. As we were discussing earlier, you make it about people. Human beings always have an interest in other human beings. So when you start looking at history through the eyes of historical figures, you're connecting man to man, woman to woman. You're looking at the past through them, and therefore that makes history even more engaging. So as you go further back in time, one of the characters in my second book is this guy called Ibrahim Adil Shah II. Your standard history textbook will say Adil Shah of Bijapur was this Muslim ruler. But he was a colorful figure. He painted his nails red, wore flamboyant clothes, wore the Rudraksh Mala, called himself son of Guru Ganapati and Saraswati, mixed up religions, confused everybody about which religion he followed. And once you start realizing that this man in the early 17th century was like this, you realize, hold on, there were interesting people all the time. There were bigots, there were interesting people, there were eccentric characters. The entire spectrum existed then as it does today. And once you get to that basic principle, history comes alive and it becomes much more vivid, much richer than the more tedious textbooks that we are usually inflicted with.
To me or to you? Well, I mean, I can't comment on the situation here in India. In Britain, enormous efforts are made the whole time to attract young people and people who were not adults, who were not educated at universities. We had these huge organizations, the National Trust and Historic England, Historic Scotland too. And between them, they own probably half or more of the big houses and castles in Britain. And you cannot visit one now without finding a whole series of things set up specially for children, archery competitions or cooks in medieval kitchens turning spits. And some people complain it's dumbing down, but if it excites interest, that's a good thing, and it does. But I don't think we have any shortage of that. I mean, the more dangerous thing to me, perhaps, is when people make films with a historical, political message, and if you haven't read the books, then people get confused. I'm thinking particularly of a notoriously bad film, I don't know if it ever came here, called Braveheart. It was about William Wallace in in Scotland, and practically in the 14th century, late 13th, 14th century, practically there was no historical fact that was true in it, an absurd relationship with the Queen of England. And yet I know, I've heard from school children in Scotland, that this is the part of history that they believe. So one needs to counter that a bit in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I think well, a couple of things. I mean, one, I would point to the title, you're taking history out of the textbooks. Sure, taking history out to people, engaging with it. But actually, I would turn it the other way around. We actually need to be putting history back in the textbooks, because too often the textbooks don't really contain history. They contain, mythified stories about the past to serve political purposes or nationalist ends or whatever they might be. So the first thing I would say is that, the bedrock does remain documents, archives, the pursuit of truth and facts in terms of what actually happened and what you can credibly argue a particular cause or whatever might have been in history. So that remains the bedrock, and I think, books in that sense are a crucial source. That said, I think the kind of thing that you're doing, for instance, with, setting up a museum of a moment like partition, it's a fantastic venture. And I think museums, objects, the accumulated stories, often oral histories, these are a really essential source, but also a way of engaging people with histories. And if you think, our museums, they're full of the most amazing objects, which every object has a story to tell. Really, and we're just not using them. Our scholars don't really connect, so historians very rarely tell their stories through stories of objects, for instance. Museums are considered a completely different domain, although those are the repositories of stories. Those are the immediate things that people can respond to. Paintings, statues, but not even in museums. Statues are all over our cities of different kinds, whether it's in temples or political statues. There are whole stories to be told there. There's a whole, histories of India to be told by statuary. Or so the landscapes contain history. The politics of street naming. So all of these things, they're there. And I think, as scholars and academics, it's our responsibility to use that material and to make it come alive, to use the museums, objects, to take our work into different arenas, whether that means by taking it through radio or podcasts or images or visual material or talks, or all kinds. Technologically now, there's so many interesting things that we can use. But, very often, I think in the academic world, there's a kind of sort of sniffiness or disdain for these, that somehow it's seen as dumbing down. And I think that's actually a real mistake. I think, bringing clarity and accuracy and truth without simplifying, without caricaturing, that's the challenge. That's the challenge, and that's an intellectual challenge. It's not simply a presentational one. Being able to think or express something clearly about a complex moment in history, that requires real analytic engagement. It's not just, how can I put this in easy words that, Shashi Tharoor would not use, as it were. Just, so I think, if we see that as an intellectual challenge, and I would say also as a political responsibility as a scholar in a democratic society at a particular moment in its history, my engaging with the Indian past is, as I said right at the beginning, engaging with our present and with our future choices. So I think, as a scholar, I want to kind of be able to talk to my fellow scholars, of course, but also to talk to us as citizens. And I think we need to use all the methods, all the richness of the presence of history all around us, and say, here it is. This is what it's about.
No, absolutely. I think, Sunil, you've encapsulated this very clearly, that how does one, which is the first interpretation, how does one engage and bring history alive, but at the same time not go into the second interpretation, which I mentioned at the beginning of the session of the topic, which is a concern that you're actually maybe taking history out, that what is happening both in our textbooks, both through the WhatsApp version of history that you mentioned, that we want to try and make history more engaging, we want it to be more appealing, but how do we stay true to facts in this age of fake news and post-truth and all this stuff? If we want to look back at history, the reality is that history has always been written by the winners, that whatever you're reading, you have to read with that critical eye of saying, who wrote this history? Who wrote this book that I'm reading? Or where is this WhatsApp coming from? So I'd love your thoughts, Manu. You mentioned the WhatsApp version of history. Can you say a little bit more about what you see happening in terms of maybe in an effort to make history more engaging? Is there a dumbing down or an oversimplification or a kind of an agenda setting that's happening that's worrying to you?
There is not a dumbing down, but an active perversion of history, an active misinterpretation of history, which is peddled by political parties and others to justify you know what. But I'm not entirely a pessimist on this, because I don't think at the end of the day quality goes out of fashion. I think we're living through a time where the internet has exploded, new platforms are being born by the day, more and more people are getting linked to this, which means that in the initial phases there will be teething troubles. People will try to exploit it for less than wise reasons. But I think in the long term, the methods of history, the matter where quality comes into the picture, these things are not going to die out. Today you'll believe this. That's the kids today, for example, an 18-year-old may believe a WhatsApp version of history. It might mess up the kid's mind for a few years, but when the kid is 28, 38, at some point, if you do have an interest in it, you will go pick up a book. The book is not going anywhere else. The WhatsApp forward will die and be replaced by another WhatsApp forward. Of course, it has the capacity to inflict great damage upon us. But all the same, books are not going anywhere. Although you see political parties and people everywhere trying to burn books, there's a reason for it. Everybody who tries to burn books, they failed at the end of the day. Ideas don't go out of fashion. Quality does not go out of fashion. At the end of the day, if your research is rigorous, if you are dealing as sincerely, as wisely, as properly as you can with historical facts, as long as you're putting it out with intentions that are not deliberately malicious, then I think your writing has more of a shelf life than any threatening WhatsApp forward. So I'm concerned that at the moment there is this WhatsApp epidemic, that there's Twitter history and screenshot history. But all the same, I don't think it's the end of the world, because good books are coming out. When I wrote my first book, I was an obscure 25-year-old writing about an obscure principality called Travancore, with an obscure protagonist called Sethu Lakshmi Bai, with 700 whole pages, and the book sold, which means there is an appetite. People are picking up books. So I don't think there is too much of a danger. There is short-term danger, but in the long term, I don't think good books are going anywhere.
Well, I think that's a wonderful view that maybe we can all hope and hold on to. But the flip side, counter-argument to that might be that, again, it depends on who's writing the books, right? So in India, I mean, we're all aware that there is, from government to government, not just this government, in previous governments, there's always been this concern of who's written the history textbooks, what's going into them. Now, David, you worked in Spain, where you said that this is actually a concern, where when the Catalonian government changed, the history textbooks were rewritten in a way that has changed how Catalonians think about themselves and their self-image. Can you say a little bit about that?
I think this is quite common in nationalist administrations everywhere, and especially in Europe. I mean, Catalonia was under the Franco dictatorship, which ended in 1975. It was an oppressed area, like every part of Spain. But then Catalonia elected a regional nationalist administration, which has been in charge of the Ministry of Education now for 40 years, and they have very much rewritten the textbooks there. And so 2 generations of Catalan children have been brought up to think of themselves as victims. Their history, they look back to the Middle Ages, and the whole of history, I mean, it hasn't had a particularly happy history, but the whole of history is presented as one of oppression from the center, from Madrid. And this has caused terrible problems, and the nationalists keep wanting more. They've got self-government, they've got their own parliament, they're among the most prosperous people in Europe. But the young are so radicalized that they insist on having independence, and they've never had it before, and it's one of the really futile causes of modern Europe, and yet it's completely divided Catalonia, which now doesn't function. And I think there's a danger that can happen anywhere with this type of situation.
So we have an optimistic potential view and a more worrying view. I think it is an important question for all of us to think about as we try and make history more engaging. How do we think about who's writing that history? And so as we're reading it, we have to look at it kind of critically. And as we're engaging it with, say, not only do I believe what's here, but what are the sources? Where is it coming from? A very interesting discussion. Thank you all. I'm going to open it up to audience questions now. So I'm going to start with the gentleman in the green shirt over there, and then we'll come to the gentleman in the gray shirt over here. Are there mics?
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me? Lovely. Hi, thank you so much for that panel. I had a question because history, along with linguistics and anthropology, is one of the 3 colonial disciplines. And as a discipline comes with the baggage of a colonial historiography that is prone to the manipulations that you described right now. And for those of us who are writing history and who are exploring history from the left, how important is it for us to challenge that historiography in our own work? And how do we ensure that we make our work as critically rigorous of itself as it is of the anti-history or the WhatsApp history that surrounds it?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. Yes, I mean, history certainly, as it's developed here, modern history it was born with the kind of nationalist project of Europe, and then became part of the colonial, a tool in colonialism. But so too, for instance, did law, and yet Indians were able to use law against the British. So similarly, I think history. It provides you a set of tools for the analysis of documents or the study of objects or archaeological excavations from which you can generate different stories and different accounts and different narratives. And indeed, if you look at British colonial history writing, it also provided Indians with tools from which to forge a kind of nationalist version of the past. Indeed, many of the very symbols of the Indian nation were discovered by British archaeologists, the Ashokan pillars and emblems of the Ashokan Empire. So, I mean, I think the fact that its origins may be in colonialism doesn't necessarily keep history, caught in that position. It can be used in a variety of different ways. But you're absolutely right. In countering other accounts of the past, we need to be rigorous, self-critical, and not simply be engaging in kind of rhetorical counters, but really turning up new evidence and new documents and new facts which are a counter to that. Now, there isn't any clear answer. It depends what kind of history you're doing, what questions you're asking, and then you would figure out, what are the rigorous, the standards of rigor you need to be adopting for that. But I think what you're saying, I mean, it's very important that one keeps that in mind, that you don't simply counter with a sort of rhetorical response.
Hi. I am Muhammad Wajiuddin. I write for the Times of India. Mr. Khilnani, this afternoon I was glancing through your book, The Incarnations, and I found 2 major omissions, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and Maulana Azad. We all know that Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, who founded MAO College, which later became the Aligarh Muslim University, his role in as a man of Renaissance for modern India, and Maulana Azad, who became 2 times President of Congress, and his role as a freedom fighter, not only that, and so many other things that he did. And he was the guy who was the leader who didn't succumb to any pressure and didn't accept the diabolical 2-nation theory. But my question is not on these 2 figures that you have omitted. My question is a larger one, that in this era of yoga, yogi, and modification, the modified India, where history is being not only rewritten, but history is being deliberately distorted. So much as that, we all know that what the Rajasthan government did. They said that in Haldi Ghati battle, it was not Rana Pratap who was defeated by Akbar's army, but it was Akbar who was defeated by Rana Pratap. Now, if this trend goes on, then what kind of history are we going to teach our children? then the generation that will grow up after 10 years or 20 years, what kind of knowledge, what kind of wisdom will they grow up, and how much damage they are doing to the institutions of India, to the academics, to the, say, history writing in this country, which has a beautiful, syncretic ethos. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just respond very quickly. Yeah, I mean, sure. In terms of who was included in the 50 and who was omitted, I mean, I'm very clear that this 50 is not a final and exhaustive list. This is my selection. I didn't include the two figures you mentioned, but I included Iqbal and Jinnah, who I think are very important also for the history of this period. So, and my 50 are a kind of invitation to argue about who should be in and out of that 50. So I'm not claiming it's an exhaustive list. I mean, on your second point, yes, I mean, I'm not quite as optimistic as Manu about, quality and truth always surfacing at the top. I think we a very difficult moment, globally, where the kind of basically the falsification and distortion of the past is now very easy to do and very easy to disseminate to audiences who don't really necessarily have the tools to figure out for themselves that this is a distortion of the past. So I think this is a real problem, and that's exactly why I think it's more important than ever at this moment for scholars, for those of us who are engaged in, have the luxury of being able to think and read and work and write about the past, to take our best version of the truth as we understand it out into the public domain. Because, bad money does push out good money in the end. So I'm actually much more worried about this, and in that sense, I think your concern is a very, very real one, and we need to be pushing back in every way possible and saying, this isn't the way things were. This isn't the story that you're telling is not true. It's simply not true.
So, Ms. Ahuwalia, may I pose a question to you, please? So I think you created history by, the museum that you've put up. I want to know what inspired it. And have you seen the Judean Museum in Berlin, which is along similar lines? I mean, it traces the war, through the eyes of ordinary people.
Thank you for the question. I come from a partition family myself, and that was very much the genesis of why I wanted to work on this project. 3 of my 4 grandparents were affected by partition, and my Nani in particular lost, their family lost almost everything they had. And I've grown up with those stories, and seeing my grandparents' friends pass away brought home a very stark realization a few years ago that we were at a very critical moment in time, that if we didn't record this story now and didn't set up a museum now, it would be too late. And already 70 years felt like too late. In fact, most people we meet and we say, oh, we're the world's first museum on partition. For a minute, they kind of look and say, really, was there nothing on? And then they're like, oh my God, yes. How did we get to 70 years with no museum on partition? So for me, it was a very personal journey, and that's what's driven my involvement. In terms of the Berlin Museum, I have not seen that, but I have seen some other museums that are very powerful and that are along similar lines. And I think what ties some of these museums together are 2 threads. One is the focus on people and really like what happened at a very personal level, so looking at history from that angle. And the second is we also think of ourselves as belonging to what many call the sites of conscience globally, that really try and pose the question to an individual to say, what would you do in a situation like this? And how can we therefore think about learning from the past so that the visitor coming in is posed with that dilemma of what if they were in that situation, how could they act in the future to prevent such things from happening again? Yeah, the gentleman in red, and then we'll take the gentleman here.
Hello, Manu. So my question to you is that, especially in the current youth, especially of people who are in 20s and 30s, with the diminishing interest in history, especially. So if I need to go to a museum, I need to convince a lot of my friends, and everybody is like, no, I don't. Most of my juniors, etc. So I think something is missing from the school side itself, like the interest in history, which we discussed in the first part of the session. So some of your suggestions of what can be done, to inculcate interest in the history. Thank you.
The intelligent are always a minority, so you can feel good that you're better than your friends in that regard. But no, I think one of the advantages of social media is that I have a modest following on Instagram, for example, and I use that to put out a lot of stories. Every now and then I put out an old black and white photograph from my research and use that to sort of link one. It's only a paragraph, but you try and sort of present the photograph in its context. And people do respond. They do ask questions. They flood me with messages saying, oh, can you tell us more about this, or where we can read more about this. That sort of thing does happen. So I think, it depends on what you make of what is available. Just as there are people distorting it, there is enough room also to make history attractive, to make it appealing, to use the very same platforms to put out, things in the right perspective. The right perspective, I think, throughout history, or things that are trying to do things in the correct or in the proper way, will always have a relatively smaller audience. So I do agree with Sunil in the sense that we are living in grave times. We do need to push back. But there is only so far that noise can go. There is only so far. If everybody in every state government is starting to rewrite textbooks, people at some point will wake up and say, hold on, go to this state and you're saying this particular person won this battle. If I'm going to the other state, someone else says something else. It's not sustainable. At some point, garbage will start looking like garbage. So I think, we're living in times where this problem exists. It's probably getting shriller and it's getting worse. But for the simple reason that stupidity can only be sustained so far, beyond a level people themselves will get up. See, look at our population. More and more people are getting into this ecosystem. At the same time as more people get educated, more people go to college and start thinking for themselves. Yes, you're trying to pervert textbooks, but if every government coming into power starts rewriting textbooks, the kids will be confused, but there will be pushback from their parents at some point saying, what are you doing? This may last for a generation, may go on for some time, but I simply don't think that it's possible to sustain utter nonsense and peddle it forever, because people at the end of the day will wake up and start demanding questions. Demanding answers, sorry. Yeah.
Well, I think, sorry, we're out of time, I think, and that's a great note to end. So stupidity is not sustainable, people, if that's your one takeaway from this
Stupidity shouldn't be underrated either.
But thank you all very much, and thank you.
History is full of sustained stupidity, actually.
Madam, one question which... One last question, time permitting.
They always are.
I just wanted to ask you a question. Madam, you had spoken about partition and what. Now, there are 2 or 3 films, Garam Hawa, which depicted Balraj Sahni and partition. But nowadays, I find the books, Freedom at Midnight, Colin Dapper depict. I find the books of today, which depict the right on partition, have a very disoriented thing. And the youngsters find it confusing as to who are the real persons who fought and got freedom from India. Like, who decided that India-Pakistan should be Radcliffe, that it should be partition. And there's a lot of confusion, so I just wanted somebody to enlighten me on that point.
Is the question who caused partition? What is, or is the question, I think you talked about a few things. One was the books, and I would actually disagree with you. I think there's a bunch of really great scholarship that has come out in recent years that has looked at partition from many different perspectives. So you have your more, the kind of the macro kind of lens. You can read Indian Summer that came out last year, Nisit Hajri's book, Midnight Furies, that came out last year. Those are the more macro versions. Or you could read the more micro versions, which look at people's experiences of partition. Urvashi Bhutalia has done a lot of great work on women's experiences of partition. I just wrote a book, you should read that, that also looks at, again, people who lived through partition and then went on to achieve success in India. Anchal Malhotra wrote a book on looking at objects. So I think there has been a lot of good work. I think the question on who caused partition is a much longer discussion that perhaps we can take offline because we're over time. And to be honest, my own interest in partition is much more around the fact that this was the largest mass migration in human history. It was an event that caused millions to lose their home, millions to die, lose loved ones. And I worry that too much of the discussion is about whose fault was it, and not enough of the discussion is about the fact that this was a humanitarian tragedy.